Welcome back to the ChemTem impact of ACEs and toxic stress on Indigenous communities. Thank you for being here. We finished modules 1 through 5 already. And so today we're going to be talking about module 6, which is interrupting toxic stress. And so we've already talked about how what causes and what influences toxic stress. We talked about ACEs and the 10 categories of ACEs, other social determinants of health, and looking at other influences, things such as poverty, discrimination, separation from family or separation from parents, how all of these things can play a role into toxic stress. We also talked about intergenerational trauma, intergenerational transmission of adversity, and how those components can also play a role in toxic stress. We talked about how there's all different types of stress. There's actually stress that is good stress, a positive stress, that there's tolerable stress, but toxic stress is one that is at elevated levels and it's over an extended period of time. And toxic stress can actually have impacts on a person's health. And so we've talked about some of those impacts that we can see with people that have 4 or more ACEs, or people that have experienced some of these other social determinants of health, and how that has impacted their health. And we've talked about those numbers as well. And so today our discussion is about interrupting toxic stress. So how do we interrupt it? And so that we began this discussion around protective factors. For example, what can we do to help encourage and support healing? In addition to screening for ACEs, how can we interrupt the stress? And so this is our topic of discussion that we'll start with here today. And so once again, our training learning objectives for all 7 of the modules is that at the end of the training, participants will be able to define adverse childhood experiences, that they'll be able to describe how providing trauma-informed care for Indigenous communities of California include an understanding of their histories. And we spent the last 2 modules talking about some of the histories of Indigenous peoples of California. And then also looking at how these experiences relate to intergenerational transmission of adversity and protective factors from an Indigenous perspective. So part of this is multi-logical thinking, a multi-logical lens. And so this training really takes aspects of scientific evidence from ACEs aware research, and then also presents an Indigenous perspective along with that. And then finally, describe how the content of these modules support screening for ACEs and treatment of toxic stress in Indigenous communities. And in this specific module, module 6, the objective is to recognize that in order to provide trauma-informed care for Indigenous communities of California, that it is vital to understand their histories. And this is part of the second objective we talked about earlier, and how these experiences relate to intergenerational transmission, factors for stress, protective factors from an Indigenous perspective. And so part of what this module is about is looking at testimonial justice. And so often Indigenous peoples are omitted from not only the data that is available, but also sometimes from narratives that we hear in regards to Indigenous peoples. Oops. And so Adichie, in this slide here, she gives a presentation on danger of a single story. And so she says, that's how we create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. But to insist on only these negative stories is to flatten my experience and to overlook the many other stories that formed me. So the single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they're incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And so kind of the message here is when we talk about some of the health disparities, the social indicators, the struggles of Indigenous peoples, sometimes that becomes the only story. It doesn't mean that those statistics are untrue. but it's not the whole picture of Indigenous peoples. And so the next testimony that I'll share is actually of myself. It's a pre-recorded clip, but we have to have the testimonies separate from the official presentation. Is entitled "More Than a Boat," and looking at Indigenous identity, and that Indigenous peoples are more than a boat. So we'll watch this clip now. Is influenced or sometimes imposed by a single dominant narrative that comes from an external lens. And oftentimes that can be through literature, it can be through Hollywood, it can be through the media, it can be through newspapers, even social media, but portray Indigenous peoples in ways that aren't necessarily identities that we ourselves identify with. Oftentimes Indigenous peoples are thought of, or their identity is imposed upon by some of the social indicators that we face. And it's true that we do suffer from some of the highest rates in the world. We know that we have 10 times the suicide rate of any other group of people. This isn't attempted suicide, this is actual suicide, 10 times the rate. We have 5 times the alcoholism rate, 2 to 5 times the death rate of our adolescents, our teenagers, compared to Euro-Americans. We have the highest rate of diabetes, the highest rate of tuberculosis, the highest dropout rates, the highest rate of death due to violence, the highest rate of people killed by police officers. So as far as social indicators and statistics, we do struggle, but those struggles do not define us. They don't define us as Indigenous peoples, and they're not our identity. And that's important for us to reclaim, recenter, and look within to our own identities and reconnecting to who we are as Indigenous peoples. The time is over where we accept the identities that others impose on us. And it's now time for us to identify ourselves and to do that as an act of testimonial justice in defining our own identity and who we are. So I'd like to start off by telling you a story about a young boy who we'll call Ijo. Ijo is a 5-year-old boy getting ready to go to kindergarten. And Ijo was brought up with the cultural teachings of his people. And so one of the stories that Ijo was presented with was the story of the blackbird and the redwood tree. And it's so fitting that we had the bird singers start us off with this presentation, because the blackbird is one that teaches us this story, and Ijo was taught this story at a young age. The little black bird, he had injured his wing. He was out playing, hurt his wing, and all his family was getting ready to leave for the winter. And when his family traveled south, he could hear the chittering of them, goodbye, goodbye. They're chattering away as all the birds flew away. And the black bird couldn't fly. His wing was broken. And so he watched them leave, and he was with his desperation, very sad. And so he began to walk along and look for shelter. He walked along, and as he was looking for shelter, he began to sing, "Ah, no, hey, oh, hi, 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 ah, no, hey, oh, hi, hi, hi." And he bumped into a tree. And this tree was a smaller tree, but it had big, beautiful white flowers on the tree. It was a dogwood tree. He bumped into the tree and he said, "Oh, Mr. Dogwood Tree," he says, "I broke my wing and my family, they left for the winter. Can I rest in your limbs for the winter?" The dogwood tree says, "Rest in my limbs for the winter? Don't you see all my beautiful flowers? If you were to rest in my limbs, you would ruin my beauty. Go on, move along, get out of here." So little black bird held on to his limb, and he continued on walking, and now it's starting to heavily rain. He starts singing, "Ah, no, hey, oh, hi, hi, yo, hi, yo. Ah, no, hey, oh, hi, hi, yo, hi, yo." And he bumps into another tree. Now this tree that he bumps into is a lot bigger. And this tree is covered with acorns all over the tree. And he says, oh, tan oak tree. He says, I'm so happy to see you. I hurt my limb. My family went south for the winter. Can I rest in your limbs for the winter? And the tan oak tree says, can't you see I'm so busy? So many of these acorns depend on me, and I have to take care of everybody. I can't be taking care of somebody else. Go along, get out of here. So the little black bird continued on, and now sleet has turned to snow, and he's dragging his little arm wing is just dragging along the snow. Oh, no, hey, oh, hi, hi, yo, hi, yo. Oh, no, hey, oh, hi, hi, yo, hi, yo. And he bumps into a redwood tree. And this redwood tree is so big that when Blackbird tries to see the top of the tree, he almost tips over backwards. It's so tall and huge. And Blackbird is so afraid, and he's nervous because he's been turned down twice. And he says, excuse me, Mr. Redwood Tree, he says, can I rest in your limbs for the winter? And the redwood tree says, sure, you can rest in my limbs. And he scooped him down with this bough and put him up on the top of the redwood tree. Blackbird was so happy. He sang, on away, oh, hi-ya, 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 on away, oh, hi-ya, hi-ya, hi-ya. So Wapekimau, who was one of our creators, was watching all of this come along, and everything happened. So Wapekimau came down and gathered together all the animals and all the trees. And he said, I watched how each of you treated the blackbird, our relative, when he was in time of need. He said, and Dogwood Tree, he said, you were so confused, so enamored by your looks and focused on your beautiful flowers. He said that you didn't have time to take care of our relation. He said, so you and all your relations, you'll only have your beautiful flowers for a short period of time. And the dogwood tree, their flowers bloom and they're gone. Not just the dogwood tree, but all the relations, all of the species of dogwood tree. And he said, acorn tree, tan oak tree, he said, you were too busy to help our friends. So you and all your relations will have the responsibility to feed the people and care for the people. You'll lose your acorns every year. And he said, but redwood tree, he said, you took care of the blackbird in his time of need. So you and all your relations will always be keepers of the forest and to look over everyone. And so Ijo learned these teachings, and he learned these types of stories. And from learning those types of stories, he built a relationship with redwood and with the natural environment. And one of the things that we use to make a redwood tree, out of a redwood tree, is an othliach. An othliach is a canoe. It's has its own spiritual life. We as Yurok people refer to ourselves as oth. We take breath in, we breathe life. And an othliach has its own spiritual life. And so Ijo grew up with this teaching of an othliach. So now Ijo starts his first day of kindergarten. And he's brought up in his family where he's learning and he's immersed in a lot of cultural teachings. And he attends that first day of school where he has a teacher that's beginning to teach him external factors of the world. And she has an activity, and this activity is that she gives each child a paper bag. And in that paper bag, they're to put 4 items that are of importance to them, things that they want to share with the rest of their class. So Ijo is so excited about this opportunity. He takes his paper bag home. Remember, he's 5 years old, and he's so excited to share about his people. And he comes in the house and runs into his room, and the first thing that he grabs is a baseball. And he says, puts his baseball in the bag. And the next thing that he grabs is a Spider-Man, and he puts the Spider-Man in the bag. And then he gets on his stool, and he crawls up, and he has on his top shelf an othliach, a carved model of an othliach that his grandfather's grandfather made for him as a boy, and which he used and plays with in the tub. And the next thing he got into his closet and pulled out a trunk, and he grabbed an eagle feather. And this wasn't a real eagle feather. It was the eagle feather that his father had painted for him to look like an eagle feather so that he could practice ceremony and practice the care of the eagle feather. And so he ran out into the kitchen. He told his mom what he's going to present. His mom said, "What are you going to say to your class?" And he says, "Well, I'm going to tell them that I'm Yurak, Hoopa, and Muskogee. And I'm going to show them my baseball. What are you going to say about your baseball?" Well, I'm going to tell them that my dad and I played baseball in the backyard every day, and it's real important to our family. And he said, and this guy here, the Spider-Man, I'm going to tell him that this is a Spider-Man and he has superpowers and he's a superhero and I'm going to be a superhero someday. And then he held out the Othliach and he says, this guy here, he said, I'm going to tell him that the Othliach has his own life. And when he's made, he has a heart, he has lungs, he has kidneys. And I take care of him and he takes care of me. Of course, his mom was real proud to hear his connection to the Othliach. And he shows his eagle feather and he says, I want to tell the class about how this eagle feather is so important to us in our prayer and how we use it. He said, I love this guy. And he set his eagle feather down. So he was prepared for his presentation. The presentation was the next day. His mom, of course, had planned to check in on him through the week. And so when he asked if she would watch the presentation, she was ready and available and she was there. And so he was the first one to be asked to share his information, to share his bag of his personal treasures. So the first thing he did when he got in the front, he was nervous because he never spoken in front of people before. He pulled out the baseball. He says, this is a baseball. My dad and I practice every day. And it's important to our family. He set it down on the desk. And then he pulled out the superhero, Spider-Man. And all the children start chitter chatter because they too enjoy Spider-Man and they get excited. So he set the Spider-Man down. Then he pulled out the Othliach. And he says, this is the Othliach. He was so excited to share with them. And one of the students says, blah, blah, blah. And he looks down at it and he says, well, it's called a Othliach. And another child says, that's not an Othliach or blah, blah, blah. That's a boat. And he looks at it, he'd never heard it called a boat before. So he says, well, I'm pretty sure it's Othliach. And suddenly a child said, I just experienced deja vu. He said, I just experienced it. And another child says, what is deja vu? And the teacher discovered a teachable moment. So she steps out in front of the class and she says, deja vu is when you experience something that you feel like you've experienced before. And so they all start talking about deja vu and their experiences with deja vu. So Ijo took his canoe, his Spider-Man, his baseball, rolled it up and went and sat down in his desk. So the teacher dismissed all the children. She dismissed them for recess. And Ijo sat there and he got up and walked over to his backpack and unzipped it, put his paper bag in there and zipped it back up. So his mom goes over to him. She said, you did such a great job presenting the items, your treasures from your bag. Yeah, he said, I didn't show him my feather though. And she said, why didn't you show them your feather? They didn't deserve it, they said. So from that moment on, he had decided and he had known that what he values and treasures the most was not valued or recognized by the educational system. And so that's a part of what I'd like to talk to you about today is looking at these identities. Is that the teacher, although with this good nature that she was going to create an assignment that would give children an opportunity to connect their home life with their school life, giving them the paper bag so that they could bring things from home. This was an opportunity for the children to be able to make that homeschool connection.
But yet when the opportunity came for the teachable moment, the teacher identified that teachable moment as the word deja vu, rather than learning the word Othliach and all that it had to entail. And so this presentation is called More Than a Boat, because like the Othliach is more than a boat. It has a spiritual significance. It has worldview. It has our philosophies and our indigenous knowledge. We as indigenous peoples, too, are more than a boat. When we look at these external indicators, things like high rates of suicide, high rates of alcoholism, high rates of violence, that's the boat. We as indigenous peoples are more than that. But when people label us as a boat, in the end, it's their loss. A 5-year-old was able to identify that they didn't deserve it. And so when we as professionals, I know there's many professionals here in the audience, is that creating space to nurture identity is also a personal investment in our growth over time. And so this picture here is an example of the Othliach. It's more than a boat, as we as indigenous peoples are more than a boat. We as indigenous people and human beings in general, we establish our self-concept of who we are within the first 5 years of our life. And so this is our worldview and our epistemology. Our worldview is a lens, and through that lens is how we perceive the world. Our worldview is made up of our values, our beliefs, and our experiences. And this worldview is established, our self-concept of who we are is established within that first 5 years of life. And it's influenced by our circle that we grow up with in the home, the external factors of extended family, of the community, is all part of developing the self-concept of a person. And so when children get into school age, 6 to 12 years old, is when they start establishing their self-esteem. They're looking at what they know in their own beliefs, values, and experiences, and comparing those beliefs with other children. And so oftentimes when children first begin school, their self-esteem plummets because they're seeing that not everyone is the same. People are different. But once they start to establish and start to build confidence in their self-esteem, around 11 years old, then they start looking at social identity. This is critical because this is when children are confident in their self-esteem, confident in their self-concept, and they're establishing in and out groups. In groups are those that have like worldview and philosophy. Out groups are those that do not. And they also can identify out groups that don't have the same worldview and philosophy, but are supportive of their worldview and philosophy. As professionals, this is really important to us because we can easily become an out group. And so thinking of ways that we can support a healthy identity development is really important. And so this is an example. This is a dissertation research that I had done years ago in looking at and asking Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk people. We had 350 participants. What are the 5 most important things to teach to your children? And the things that came up were things like relationships with the natural environment, relationships with the human realm of the world, elders, extended family, community, having that connection to our people and where we come from, and a connection to spirituality, our regalia, our songs, our ceremony, our concepts of creation. Having cultural skills like basket making, regalia making, playing sticks, learning how to play cards, learning how to gather, and characteristics and values like being humble, having a good heart, being generous, kind, nurturing, being a good listener. These are all things and components that Indigenous peoples, Hupa, Yurok, and Karuk, identify as important to teach to our children. Yet when we look at educational systems, and if you were to look at statistics, you might think that Indigenous peoples are failing. But in actuality, our goals for our children are very different. In the school system, a person is deemed gifted if they're in the top 1% of standardized test scores. In our communities, people are deemed gifted if they have a personal connection to the environment, for example. Our people, California Indigenous peoples, are very unique in our history. And we had contact with non-Indigenous people much later than the rest of the country. And so, and looking at how long we have been here, Hupa, Yurok, Karuk people along the coast, we've been here since the beginning of time, all of us as Indigenous peoples throughout California. We have our own centers of the world, our own creation stories, but looking at scientific evidence, carbon dated, Hupa, Yurok, Karuk, Talawa people have been here 7,000 to 12,000 years. And so when we talk about our connection to homeland, we're not just talking about loving a place or feeling connected to a place, but thinking about our ancestors, our parents, 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 for the last 12,000 or more years, walked in the same footsteps that we walk today. That when we are in ceremony and we're barefoot and our feet touch the ground, that our feet are dancing in the same footsteps of our ancestors for 12,000 years or more. We call that Wichwo Ayadin, Wichwin Ayadin, that connection. That's what we see as giftedness. So we're more than a boat. If someone were to create space and to learn more about us as Indigenous peoples, they would see that we are a thriving people. We are flourishing. We are all survivors of genocides that our people have experienced. And as Chairman Hunter was speaking to before, one of the biggest numbers that I ever always remember and always express is in 1850 in California, we had 1 million California Indians, but by 1900, there's 17,000. It's 983,000 Indigenous peoples of California that died during genocide. But we are survivors of those 17,000. We're not only survivors, but we are flourishing. We are bringing back ceremonies. We're bringing back language. We are re-identifying ourselves, and we are speaking out and ensuring that we're recognized for who we are and not for the external factors of other people's definitions of who we are. So what are some things that we can do as professionals? I know we have groups of professionals here. I know we have groups of young people here. And I think the first and most important thing in this process is to be aware of our bias. That every human being is born with bias. That's a part of development. When a person is 5 months utero, a child can tell the difference between their parents' voices and strangers' voices. They already can distinguish that. So when they're born, we talk about talk to the baby so that the baby feels safe. That in itself is bias. Within 3 months, a child establishes that bias. So bias is something that we as human beings all have. And when we interact with others, we undoubtedly are influenced by our own perceptions. So the first step to creating spaces and nurturing healthy identity development is to be aware of how our assumptions, expectations, and interpretations influence our other people. And this is important particularly for professionals, because if we were to list the things that we see as being important to us to teach to our children, they undoubtedly would be different in many ways than other Indigenous communities. And so it's important for us to understand that Indigenous communities have their own worldview and their own values and beliefs in teaching their children. Another step is, as Chairman Hunter also talked about, shifting the paradigm. Shifting the paradigm of these institutional frameworks. Remember that these institutional frameworks were created to benefit a certain group of people. And as long as we are still utilizing these same frameworks, these philosophies continue to resonate to benefit those groups of people. And those particular groups don't even realize that they're benefactors of these systems. So for example, the educational system. The educational system was created as an assimilation tool for Indigenous peoples. The whole concept behind it was kill the Indian, save the man. Shed everything about that person's identity and what makes them an Indigenous person. The idea was kill everything about them in order to save the man. In order to civilize them, we must Christianize them. There was 4 tenets of colonial education and how it began. And the first was that all Indians are savages. This word savages, I put quotes around it because we try to change it and make it different, but it began as a derogatory term. All Indians are savages. The second was that in order to civilize them, we must Christianize them. The third is that parents are detrimental to the civilization process. And so we must move children as far away as possible. And the fourth was that Indigenous children or Indian children have certain mental, physical, emotional deficiencies. So certain pedagogical methods have to be used to educate them. So what that means is that was justification to say that Indigenous peoples learn in different ways. So we have to do things like put a red hot needle through their tongue for speaking their language, or teach them manual labor because that's the only type of education that they actually will be successful with. So when we think about things like, I hear oftentimes in teachers' lounges, teachers asking, how do I get parents to be involved? I want parents to come and be a part of the classroom, and I want parents to be a part of the school, but they're just not responding. And my first question is, what have we done to shift the paradigm of this institution? This institution was created to separate parents from children because parents were seen as detrimental to the civilization process. How has that philosophy changed? What have we done to shift that? It's more than just sending an invitation in an email. It's about creating space for parent contribution. And so this is so important in looking at shifting this paradigm, because paradigms exist in the judicial systems, paradigms exist in mental health, paradigms exist in police academies, the police system. So all of these systems were created with this historical, cultural, social legacy that we have to be aware of. And although one person can't shift the paradigm on their own, awareness is the first step. Being aware and finding ways to get to the root to be able to shift that system. Another piece in this process and of things that we can do is to promote testimonial justice. Testimonial justice, I'm working, or actually we're finished with this project, but just finished a book chapter on resilience with Charlene Wan, Bronk Colegrove, Tesha Gensaw, and Gable Ammon, 4 youth from this area. And the book that it's going to be in is a handbook of resiliency among youth. Who more qualified to write a book chapter about youth than youth themselves? That's testimonial justice. It's that we as Indigenous peoples our story has been told by others for hundreds of years. And now it's time for us to tell our own stories. Just like I said, I think Chairman Hunter and I were on the same page, because this is the same kind of ideals that he's speaking to. But most importantly is that testimonial justice is a tool to healing. So we have people who have experienced trauma, whether it's intergenerational trauma or ongoing trauma, but sharing their story, sharing their experience is so important in the healing process. And so Jack Norton, who is an Indigenous scholar, also a historian, professor, he says that in the telling and in the listening, humanity meets. I think that's so important. In the telling and in the listening, humanity meets. For professionals in the field, oftentimes this is one of the beginning steps, is when people have experienced an injustice, their truth, their perspective is important. It's valuable, and it's essential to the healing process. Now, we're an action-oriented society because we've been conditioned to believe through our educational systems that we have to have a solution. But sometimes in the healing, part of the healing is to listen and not jump to a solution in this process. Testimonial justice is also a space to give opportunities for our young people to identify themselves, to share their experiences, to create space. But it's so important that when we create these spaces, that we're creating them in ways that our children that we're working with can be free to share who they are, not a confined space like what happened in Ijo's story, where he was attempting to share a piece of himself, and that wasn't noted or wasn't recognized. So these are just some pieces in looking at how do we support healthy identity. And so in supporting that is being aware of our own bias, that we all have our own biases. I want to mention that in these biases, we have implicit bias and we have explicit bias. And so implicit bias is, or I'll start with explicit bias, is bias that we know we have, and we choose whether to unveil it or not unveil it, depending on whether we feel like we have a safe space. I think this is interesting because sometimes when we talk about the climate today, and in some ways it seems that there's more racism, discrimination, social inequities, and injustices than there were before in earlier times. But the matter is that those injustices were always there, but that was veiled because people knew that they had these biases, but there wasn't a safe space that nurtured for them to be able to express this. And now there's many pockets that create these safe spaces, and that's why you're seeing it happening even more. So this implicit bias, explicit bias, we decide whether to unveil it or not, but we know that we have it. But we also have an implicit bias, and that's one that we don't even realize we have. But we as human beings all have explicit and implicit biases. That's part of being a human being. But just because we are good people doesn't mean that it doesn't have long-lasting impacts on others. I often think of the National Women's Indian Association, which was an association of women that felt that the best thing for Indigenous peoples was for them to be civilized through this boarding school process. And so this organization raised monies to keep boarding schools in effect. From their own personal lens, they felt that they knew what was best for another group based on their own bias. They considered themselves to be good people. But boarding schools had long-lasting effects on Indigenous peoples that we still suffer from today. And at some point, it'd be fun to share a lot more of that information with you. But good people can also
all the
have
stuff's
bias.
On the porch.
So being aware of that bias is very important. There's another aspect of that bias, which is the cloning mechanism. The cloning mechanism is when we see similarities in someone else, then we assume that everything is the same. And sometimes in Indigenous communities, we do this, that because we're from the same tribe, we assume the experience is the same. Because we're the same family, we assume the experience is the same. But they're different. Everyone has their own truth. Everyone sees the world through their own values, through their own experiences and their own beliefs. Each person is more than a boat. They're more than what they appear to be on the outside. And then once again, shifting the paradigm of institutions. And then finally, the piece of testimonial justice.
Looking at testimonial justice in this discussion and talking about Indigenous identity, and also moving into this discussion about interrupting toxic stress, is looking at other testimonies. And so we're going to be talking about different testimonies of Indigenous community members. When we're talking about interrupting toxic stress, we look at the different protective factors. And so, and we talked about this before when we talked about how toxic stress can have health implications. But if there aren't certain protective factors, or if there isn't supporting a kind of a network. And so it's important to understand that just because a person has a high ACE score, or because a person has intergenerational traumas, or is experiencing intergenerational transmission of adversity, just because a person is experiencing ongoing oppression, doesn't mean that they're destined to have certain health conditions. And that one way to interrupt this toxic stress is through these protective factors. And so as you see on the slide here, protective factors are intrinsic or extrinsic conditions or attributes that mitigate risk for toxic stress, such as curiosity and interest in learning, ability to pay attention and persist in completing tasks, ability to regulate emotions and behavior, feeling cared about and heard when things are hard, having a sense of belonging in school and in the community. And in addition to biological factors like differences in telomere length, which we'll talk about, and the serotonin transporter genes, which we'll also talk about. And so when we look at some of these intrinsic factors, you can see on the right of the diagram some of the things that we talked about. The intrinsic factors with the ability to pay attention, ability to regulate emotions, and then the extrinsic is the buffering relationships, supportive environments, community resources. And so in looking at Indigenous communities, what are some of the protective factors from an Indigenous perspective? Another thing to note is when we talk about telomeres, telomere length. And so one of the things that helps to protect any type of health disparity is the telomere length. There's telomeres on the end of the chromosomes that protect them, and that when people participate in specific activities, the telomere length can actually elongate, which is part of that protective factor and part of protecting a person. And so telomeres are part of chromosomes that protect them from degradation. The shorter the telomere length has been associated with premature cellular aging. And so this comes from the Roadmap for Resilience. And once again, this was written by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris and her team, and it's something that you can access online if you want to read more about. Also, telomere lengthening is one mechanism by which protective factors may improve health. Interventions may reduce stress and protect or even lengthen telomeres. This is really important, is that intervention may reduce stress and protect or even lengthen telomeres. And so when we talk about different protective factors and how they can actually be really important in supporting a person's health. Although chromosomes may be impacted through intergenerational transmission of adversity, it's also important to recognize that telomeres that protect the chromosomes can be lengthened by protective factors. So I just want to reiterate that point again, is that we're talking about how ACEs, how social determinants of health, how intergenerational trauma, how intergenerational transmission of adversity, and how other aspects, experiences can affect and cause toxic stress. But in addition to that, which can lead to health disparities, although chromosomes may be impacted through intergenerational transmission of adversity, it's also important to recognize that the telomeres that protect the chromosomes can be lengthened by protective factors. And so from an Indigenous perspective, protective factors can include singing, dancing, family support networks, etc. And so we're going to hear more testimonies of what, from an Indigenous perspective, are protective factors. What are the things that have helped? And we talked about in the Chemtem story, the treasures woven within the Chemtem basket. We talked about how each generation picked up the basket. They learned from the knowledge of those before, and they contributed and put the basket back in the water for the next generation. In that story, the basket, Chemtem, all those treasures could be seen as, from an Indigenous perspective, protective factors, tools that help to lengthen telomeres to protect the chromosomes of a human person. And so we'll talk more in hearing testimonies about what, from an Indigenous perspective, are other protective factors. And so the first person that we'll hear from is Caitlyn Still. Caitlyn is Yurok. She is a resident of Humboldt County. She graduated from College of the Redwoods with the AA and Behavioral and Social Services with highest honors in 2018. And then she graduated from Humboldt State with a BA in social work in 2020, and then her master's degree in social work in 2021.
My name is Caitlyn Still. I'm a Humboldt County local and an enrolled member of the Yawk tribe. I graduated from College of the Redwoods with an Associate of Arts in Behavioral and Social Science, and I graduated from Humboldt State University with a bachelor's and a master's in social work. I have experience working within trauma through my role as a client advocate at Humboldt Domestic Violence Services for the past 2.5 years. And I also have experience through my internship at Open Door Community Health Centers within the Behavioral Health Department, the Substance Use Department, and the Case Management Department. I have an ACE score of 9, and at the age of 21, my life was permanently changed with the onset of fibromyalgia, which is a result of my high ACE score and childhood trauma, and never being able to feel that I had anywhere I could go that was safe, that I could let my guard down. When I learned about ACEs many years ago, I wanted to talk to my doctor about it, but I was afraid that it wouldn't be taken seriously because ACEs are often only attributed to mental health issues. And oftentimes, doctors fail to see that ACEs can impact the body physically. This training is very important because in Humboldt County, we have a health crisis with really high ACE scores, and then Indigenous peoples especially are disproportionately affected by high ACE scores. And then it's worsened because we're in a rural context, which limits access to healthcare, especially transportation to and from healthcare appointments. And then these high ACE scores can lead to medical issues, mental health issues, further trauma. These ACE scores will lead to more ACE scores down the line for future generations if not intervened on. And so without these ACE score trainings and these early interventions and screenings, they will only become worsened. When talking about ACEs, it's important to know that a high ACE score does not mean a person will not be successful in life. It actually can increase a person's resiliency and allow for that person to bounce back easier and quicker when they experience trauma or other hardships later on in life. Early intervention with ACEs through screening is very important because in early childhood it can prevent ACEs from happening even further, and even acknowledging heightened risk and preventing lifestyle choices from worsening risk of certain diseases and hardships is really beneficial. To increase resiliency, there are things like protective factors, which are these conditions and attributes in individuals, families, and communities that help people cope better when dealing with stress and trauma. And these are things like connection to culture, connection to family and religion. Coming from a social work perspective and background, I know social work has historically been really harmful to communities, especially Indigenous communities. And so it's important to know that my profession has come from a harmful background. And for me to purposely take a stand against that and work with a decolonization lens, Indigenous peoples have disproportionately high rates of death from alcoholism, chronic liver disease, diabetes, unintentional injuries, and suicide. And these deaths are connected to colonization, connected to historical trauma that continues to live on and affect today's generation of Indigenous peoples. People with high ACE scores often utilize the emergency department more than people with lower ACE scores. And a 2020 study by Perkey et al. Suggests that increasing access to primary care will decrease emergency department usage among people with high ACE scores, because people with high trauma burden often have low tolerance for distress, and waiting to see a primary care provider might feel like it's not a feasible option. Even though historical trauma is not an official criteria under ACEs, it is almost a default ACE that every Indigenous person has because of that collective experience of historical trauma that continues to affect people passed down through generations. Being in the medical field, whether you are in health education promotion, behavioral health, or medical, you have the opportunity to intervene in these cycles of trauma and prevent them from being passed down again. You have the opportunity to encourage protective factors and encourage resiliency through connecting patients with cultural resources. Cultural identification has been shown to be a preventative factor for things like alcoholism and drug use among Native American people.
One of the things that Caitlyn highlights, some of the protective factors that she speaks of, is she shares that she has an ACE score of 9. And we talked about trauma-informed care and about safety. And one of the things that Caitlyn has shared is that it has been a struggle for her finding a place that is safe. She also identifies protective factors as connection to culture, connection to family, increased access to primary care. And so the next testimony that we have is from Teresina White Rose Obie, and she is also a Yurok tribal member. And in 2013, Teresina graduated from Georgian Court University in Lakewood, New Jersey, with her bachelor's in social work. And then in 2016, she graduated from the Graduate School of Social Services from Fordham University in New York City. And since graduating, she's worked in local, state, and federal level of tribal welfare and school-based mental health. And so this is Teresina's testimony of protective factors.
Naknau Teresina White Rose Obie. I'm a Yurok tribal member and a descendant of the Karuk, Hoopa, and Tohono O'odham tribes. I was raised on the Hoopa Valley Indian Reservation in Northern California. After completing high school at Hoopa Valley High, I attended Georgian Court University in Lakewood, New Jersey, where I received my bachelor's in social work. From there, I attended Fordham University in New York City and completed the Graduate School of Social Services. I would like to start today off with a story. There once was a little 5-year-old girl who lived with her grandmother. Their love for each other was an unbreakable bond. When the grandmother was working in the garden or outside the home, the little girl knew to hide underneath the porch when visitors came to the house. On this particular day, the little girl noticed a vehicle approaching the house, and she went and hid under the porch as instructed to do so. While the little girl was hiding, she could see the familiar face through the cracks of the porch. So she came out from hiding. As a family member enticed the little girl with candy, she left with him in his vehicle. While driving away from her home, the little girl knew something was wrong. And from that day, she never seen her grandmother again. This is the story of my great-great-grandmother. She was stolen from her home for $1 and put into boarding school. While in boarding school, she experienced physical, emotional, sexual, and spiritual abuse for the first time in her life. She is stripped of her culture and language by being starved, beaten, and sexually violated. My great-great-grandmother was only able to pass on a few stories from her boarding school experience because her treatment was so horrific and inhumane. Her treatment in Phoenix Indian boarding school was done with the intention to conform and assimilate to the dominant society, to what European Americans believed was the American way of life. Boarding school was seen as an ideal structure to eradicate Native American culture and make model citizens of Indigenous people. Their goal was to destabilize and eliminate tribal and community living by the exploitation, neglect, and torture of our Indigenous children. Because of this, we can continue to see the lasting effects that was done. We see how intergenerational historical trauma and grief is systemic and ongoing oppression. Through the trauma of invasion, diseases, the boarding school era, and other facets of the Indigenous experience, such as chemical dependency, poverty, and mental health discrepancies. However, we are still here. We will continue to remain in the land of our ancestors. Going back to the story of my great-great-grandmother, and in her short time spent with her grandmother, she knew what love was. Through all the atrocities she went through at boarding school, it was her grandmother's love that kept her alive. 4 generations before me attended boarding school. I am the first to participate as a dancer in our traditional ceremonies. Growing up, I always wondered why my maternal lineage did not participate in ceremonies. It wasn't until I learned about the horrific truth of what the boarding school era and the negative impacts that were made for our past generations. As I prepared for my flower dance, our coming of age ceremony, and the ability to participate in our traditional ceremonies, I remember having a conversation with the women in my life. I was told I was bringing the circle back around to heal my ancestors through ceremonies. That what my family, like many others, found healing in the collective energy of balance and harmony. It was through the preservation of our ceremonies that my DNA and genetic memory, I was dancing for my ancestors. I remember my first time dancing in our ceremonies. A part of me cried for my mother, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, and my great-great-grandmother, because they were never able to experience dancing because of the effects of the boarding school era. This was a monumental moment in my life because ceremony has shaped me into who I am today. By participating in ceremonies from a young age, I was fortunate my mother took me up and down the Klamath and Trinity rivers, visiting elders and learning about their experiences and their participation in revitalizing ceremonies, language, and traditional practices. I gained valuable knowledge in visiting the elders and try my best to continue their legacy. During my adolescent years, I struggled with self-esteem and negative body imagery. I was struggling with who the European American society was telling me how I should look and act versus living a traditional life in balance and harmony. Finding the balance in a world that tried to eliminate my people. These adversities led to eating disorders, depression, and a poor reflection of cognitive and emotional health. I struggled in my education of having a poor diet and not eating healthy or traditional foods that helped with brain function and mobility. I was influenced by peer pressure by being a follower and not a leader. If it wasn't for the strong, intelligent, and beautiful people in my life, I'm afraid to think where I would be. However, through ceremony, I found healing. Healing not only for myself, but healing for the past generations. This led to self-acceptance and love. With the support of my biological and spiritual family and my involvement in ceremonies, I found my self-worth and purpose on a cellular and molecular level. During my flower dance, a coming of age ceremony, one of my prayers was for a quality education, not only in a Western capacity, but traditional knowledge and understanding of our physical and spiritual experiences. I was able to integrate my traditional learning into my Western education experience, taking the same discipline and learning of my traditional ceremonies and practices I used in the classroom. My prayers was to obtain a quality education and return to my tribal community. As a social worker professional, I've returned to my tribal community with the intention to help heal intergenerational and historical trauma and grief. And in my experience, participating in ceremony is one of my pillars of strength that has helped heal past generations. Obtaining my Western education, a system whose foundation was to eliminate tribal societies, I found the balance to help heal and use education as a tool. This is done by recognizing the traumas and learning to identify areas to uplift our tribal communities. For professionals learning and working in tribal communities, it is important to hear the people and their stories. It's easy to recall theories, applications, and frameworks that we learned in school, but remember our healing, tribal healing from systemic structures, is finding our way back to a traditional lifestyle. Use the community resources, communicate with our tribal entities, and learn from the people, not the textbooks lessons we found in school. Furthermore, learning and education is a lifelong commitment. The more we continue to learn and heal, the stronger our future generations will be. Although the Indigenous experience is full of hardships, inequalities, and systemic and ongoing oppression, as Indigenous people, we are continuing the movement to work together and share our experiences to help heal tribal communities, heal through education and ceremony, and finding the balance and harmony to return to a traditional lifestyle. Thank you.
Teresina Obie, she shares her experience of her grandmother, and this is an example of how a grandmother going to boarding school, how intergenerationally that can impact both behaviorally as well as biologically the future generations. And so some of the things that Teresina highlights here as protective factors is rite of passage ceremony. The ceremony, sometimes referred to as a flower dance that acknowledges a young girl transitioning into a young woman. And one of the things Teresina speaks to is that she was able, her experience in her ceremony was provide an opportunity to come full circle. So after 4 generations before her went to boarding school, that she had the opportunity to participate in ceremony and to participate in this rite of passage ceremony into womanhood. Another protective factor that Teresina identifies from her perspective is supportive relationships, whether these are biological relationships, people that you're related to in your own family, extended family, as well as looking at spiritual families, families that you participate in ceremony, families that you have connections with can be protective factors. Involvement in ceremony, ceremony as a part of life and preparation for ceremony, participating in ceremony can be seen as a protective factor. In addition to that, learning about our own identities, learning about ourselves, and part of that growth, having connection can be a part of the protective factors, as well as prayer was also identified by Teresina. And so then the next person that will share a testimony, perspectives of protective factors is Princess Jintcon Colegrove. Princess Jintcon is Hoopa, Yurok, and Karuk. She's a Hoopa tribal member from the villages of Metdilden, Takamelding, and Dishdangading. She's also Nur, which is a coastal Yurok from the villages of Chapek and Espel. She's an advanced Hoopa language student and was a teaching assistant at the Ithtuk Language Center. Princess completed her Hokutchiswal, her coming of age ceremony, when she was 13 years old. And since then, she's been selected to carry medicine and healing ceremonies, as well as to represent her people in the brush dance, which is a ceremony for the balance of humans and the world. So currently, she's a junior at Humboldt State University, majoring in environmental studies and a minor in American Indian education. She also is a CamTem book author.
My name is Princess Colegrove. I am a member of the Hoopa Valley tribe, and I'm also Yurok and Karuk, and I am 19. and I'm currently a student at Humboldt State University, and I wrote chapter 22 of the book Camtem, A Journey Towards Healing. So the culture and ceremony has played a big role in my life personally. I've grown up in ceremony and doing cultural things with my family and my friends, and that's always been a big part of my life. That is my life. And so it's always really important for people to understand that. If I didn't have culture and ceremony so heavily in my life, it would definitely be a lot different. I would have a very different outlook on things and different worldview, and I would not be doing what I'm doing. I probably would not be in school. I might have a job, but I wouldn't have anything set in stone, steady, anything ready. It would just be a lot different. I grew up in a place where a lot of the children around me were very disconnected, and there are a lot of examples of the different paths that these kids choose. Some choose to try and find people to surround themselves with people who do have knowledge and are willing to show them, and they go to talk to elders and teachers and learn things, and they make a connection. And then there are other kids who don't do that. They don't know where to start. They get overwhelmed. They don't want to know, or they don't know how to learn this information. They don't know how to talk to the people who can teach them. And so they end up doing things like hanging out with people that are doing drugs or drinking a lot, and in a different crowd than somebody who has been able to grow up with these connections. So I had my flower dance in Hoopa, on the Hoopa Valley Indian Reservation, and it's called a Hoketcheswal in Hoopa. And my flower dance for me was really a time that I matured and grew up a lot. And I was able to see things differently than I did before my flower dance when I was really young and a child. So it really helped me to mature in the things that I learned. I worked with a lot of different people that I didn't know I would be so close with, and made a lot of different connections with people who just showed up because it showed me that they are there for me. And so it really helped me to realize the connections that I do have with people, even though beforehand I didn't know that those connections were there. I had a lot of highlights from my flower dance. A few of them were working with people and visiting, and a lot of learning things. So one person that came to work with me, she showed me how to weave a basket and make a plate. Another was visiting with my aunt, and another was running with my dad, because on the finish up day you go on a really long run with a father figure or your dad, whoever that might be. And for me it was my dad. And so we ran along the river, and we had to communicate in a way that we weren't used to. We had to actually talk to each other when normally we can just kind of look at each other and know what's going on. And so that was something that was different for me, but it was also a highlight. One thing that I would like for medical professionals to take from my chapter is to understand that there's beauty in everyone, and that everyone is valued and gifted. And that just because there are some assumptions of Native people being alcoholics or drug addicts or no good people, that person means something to someone. It's also really important to know that Native people are a part of something bigger than just them. It's a community, and we have a lot of family, and sometimes when one of us is in the hospital, everybody wants to check and make sure. And we have our own ways of healing. We eat acorns in ceremony, and it's something that's super nutritious and healthy and helps your body kind of reboot itself. And we do things like we have what we call mahachet holen, which is really important to us, and we burn it. And so sometimes we come in and we do that, and medical professionals don't know what's going on. They want to control the situation, and they want everyone to kind of stay in line and do what they say, but we have our own ways of healing too.
Jinson's testimony, some of the things that she brings up as protective factors. She, in her testimony, she really speaks to how culture has been an integral tool in interrupting responses to toxic stress. And so she describes culture as influential on her outlook, worldview, and her self-perception of her role in the world. In addition, she highlights ceremony and her coming of age ceremony, the Hokachiswa, as helping her to build relationships and to understand her value and to build connections. And then she also emphasizes the importance of each individual to the community. And shares her message with medical providers on this. She speaks to the importance of basket making as a protective factor, running in particular, running with her father during ceremony, and learning new ways of communication, relationships with the community, and then also traditional methods of healing. And once again, this is part of this multilogical thinking, is that there can be multiple perspectives, multiple truths. And just as we're speaking into kind of the ACEs aware and scientific evidence, and kind of paralleling that or integrating into that Indigenous perspectives, the same as with traditional methods of healing, is it's important to understand that Indigenous peoples have had traditional methods of healing for thousands of years, and that's an important part of Indigenous knowledge, and from an Indigenous perspective, also a protective factor. So our next testimony, and looking at protective factors from an Indigenous perspective, these are just a few people that are sharing, and of course every person has different perspectives on what these protective factors could be. But our next person is Peter Gensaw, and he's Yurok, and he's the cultural director for the Ancestral Guard. Ancestral Guard is a community organizing network developed to encourage an Indigenous mindset and engage the people who live in Yurok ancestral territories to respect, become a part of, and restore a natural balance between people and the environment that we all share. He's also an artist. He's a Yurok language speaker, a singer, a cultural advocate, a regalia maker, a youth leader, a hunter, and a gatherer. And so his work and focus are strongly rooted in the strengths and activities of his skills as a Yurok practitioner and a cultural bearer. And I think this interview is really important to understand that it's occurring out in nature. And sometimes people don't have access to the same types of resources. And this one, we are thinking about service and providing services to Indigenous communities, is that sometimes we have to think about what types of services are actually available. And so in this example, there are some kind of fades in and out with the Wi-Fi, etc. But it's important because it's a part of the natural environment and the surroundings of Peter.
Hui Nick now Peter Gensaw. I come from the village of Rekwall, Terror, Crest City Arc. Yeah, so I'm Yurok tribal member. I'm a little mixture from little different tribes up and down the coast, from Tawa tribe all up to Creek tribe. I enrolled in Yurok tribe and I practice my tribal heritage there. My most important cultural teachings, I would have to say, is jump dance. Through jump dance, the dance of world renewal, it just changed me as a man. Changed. It gave me the opportunity to help others, just a lot more than my just what I could do on a daily basis. What I learned about the jump dance is a couple different elders in our community, highly respected people, brought me and my brothers along. I started off with just going up gradually up to the hike in the high country. Then once we got up there, we discussed the aspects of everything and how to handle everything and whatnot. But those two main people were Walt Lara and Chris Peters, Hambone. Those two were my biggest mentors in starting me in that dance. And after that, we hiked around, packed medicine for people. Then we came down the mountain and just started the whole process of the world renewal. It was like a camping trip up in the high country that they all just talked about and showed us how to do things and why we do things. One of the main things I learned on that trip is for everybody's well-being around us. Just because they're not on the mountain with us, we're here for them too. But other than that, working as a team, making sure everybody walks at the right pace, everyone's fine, no one's working too hard, make sure we're all healthy, have enough water, stay hydrated. Even building camp together, it's just a whole bunch of opportunities for growth. My grandmother and my mom. For me, I started off with beading at a real young age, and these are some pretty strict Yurok women. They said, no, it's a nice necklace, but you have some impurities here. They said this beadwork traditionally should go this way, or you messed up here, there. And every time they told me that, I would bust down the whole necklace and start back over. And that helped me grow just as a person. So I know to get help from others, come along to help, to talk to them. Don't be afraid to ask for help from people. But another couple elders out there were, we have a couple from Merkwall actually. There's Awak Murphy Oliver. He was there just to help teach fish. He helped us along the riverside. Then farther up the hill, we have Walt Jr. But he actually taught me and my brothers how to fish down to a T. Because we thought we knew how to fish with Walt, but once we left Walt, we were fishing professionals. Yeah. But I like to keep in touch with a whole bunch of elders from the bottom of the Klamath River all the way to the top, just for stories, or if I have any problems in life, I can go talk to them as a counselor or anything like that. They can help me out. It's always good. So when I was younger, first thing I started doing is keeping in touch with others. I would cook them breakfast, lunch, or just do some yard work eventually. But hanging out with them was the main thing. Then just keep in touch with them when you ask them if they need anything, if they, one main thing, ask if they need anything. And what I like to do is I'm a hunter / fisher gatherer, and I go by the season. So right now it's Dungeness crab season. And I'll ask them, hey, do you guys eat crab, and how many people you got in your household? And they'll tell me X amount of people or how many crab they like, and I'll just go fulfill the order, go out crabbing, set my crab pots, catch them fresh food, fresh produce. It's always about keeping in touch, make sure they have everything they need for a healthy life too. It is this nonprofit that my brother Sammy Gensaw started. First, it was just a youth group in the community where original name was Smokehouse Boys. But later on, somebody wrote a book and got the name Patton Smokehouse Boys. So we changed it. And with that changing of the name, we all sat down and discussed, we're more than just a group of youth. And yes, we're a handful of youth boys right now, but we'd like to expand to other youth, not just boys. So we changed the name. Sam came up with the Ancestral Guard. So that means if you're on ancestral territory, you're eligible for our teachings and our practices. Life will throw a lot of challenges and stuff your way, no matter what, no matter who you are, no matter where you come from. But for me, myself, having such strong ties with my culture and my roots and heritage and people, I always fall back on them if I'm stressed out. Because as a young Yurok man, one thing we like to say is how you feel inside is really hard for us to break down in tears as men, any men. So Creator gave us the square drum. With that square drum, it's an amplifier from the heart. So we project our singing and our feelings throughout the drum. So if I'm feeling sad, I can sit down, I can bust out a sad song, make my people around me feel my sadness. But if I'm really happy, I'll sing a happy song and a good song and uplift everyone's energy and spirit around me. They should understand about us Indigenous people. We've been through a lot of trauma. Our ancestors been through trauma, so it's embedded in our DNA. So we all have that in us just a little bit. I have a couple friends, when they're kids, they said they're young, they hear a car drive by on the road and they just hit the brush line. They don't know why. No one talked to them, no one taught them that. It's just in their DNA as kids from us Indians. But other than that, I think medical professionals. They diagnosed a lot of us Indigenous kids with ADHD because we have a lot of energy and stuff like that. I myself was diagnosed with that when I was a little kid, but I went outside and I went to hit the traditional trails. I went fishing, I went hunting, gathering, and I put most of my energy towards that stuff. And I've actually balanced my life out so I can focus on my work and my schooling that I needed to do. One thing I would like to say to all the medical professionals out there is us Indigenous people, we are a little bit wired different, I would say, than other Americans out there. We think different. Our process and our thoughts, everything, even our body, how we intake our food. We don't have the enzymes to naturally bust down some of the American processed foods that we all consume today. But other than that, I'd say my traditional way of life tied me to strong roots of my family, tied me strong roots of the land that I come from. Having said that, just keeping those connections strong will make you healthier.
The protective factors that Peter talks about in his presentation is hiking in the high country. And so he shares his experience training for a world renewal ceremony. And he describes the teaching as teaching him to become a man and how important it is to take care of each other. And through his cultural experiences, he learned to help others and to build and maintain relationships. And so sometimes when we think about something like a hike into the high country, we might not understand all of the camaraderie and all of the important pieces that are connected and attached to this process as well. And so Peter describes his relationships with his teachers from the community and how influential they've been in his life. He talks about the role of the Ancestral Guard, which he explains is a nonprofit organization that emphasizes the food sovereignty and advocacy for the natural environment. And one of the tools that Peter utilizes to cope with difficult times is relationship with people, the natural environment, and the culture. And so he describes utilizing singing and drumming. He says that the square drum is an amplifier from the heart, and we project our feeling and our healing through the drum. And so, and he speaks of these different protective factors. He had so much information that was in this short interview. And one thing that he says is that it's embedded in our DNA, and he's talking about a reference to fear, and he says that it's embedded in our DNA. And what do you think he means when he says that? And so this is from Peter's perspective, and thinking about fear. He said that sometimes people will hear a sound and just kind of drop to the ground, and that's embedded in our DNA. And so this is a perspective, an Indigenous perspective, but it's also supported by the field as well, that a study in the field of stress physiology involved male mice. And I mentioned this a couple of modules ago, that were conditioned to fear certain smells by pairing scents with shock. And Diaz and his colleagues found that the offspring of the odor fear conditioned male mice were extremely sensitive to the odor. So despite never having ever had their family, never having met their fathers, and never having been odor fear conditioned themselves, that even the grandchildren of the fear conditioned mice also experience extreme odor sensitivity. So in other words, this fear conditioning was actually passed from grandfather to grandfather to father to grandson. And so this is, important when we're thinking about how that kind of fear factor can be transmitted into following generations. And we think about, and going back to the module 5 and thinking about the history of Indigenous Californians, and thinking about some of the things that Indigenous peoples have experienced within the last 5 generations. Looking at periods of genocide, looking at massacres, slavery, boarding school, relocation, all of these things that could very well instill kind of this sense of fear that could potentially transfer for generations. And so Peter's words here, and speaking of this embedded in our DNA, has actually some research that can follow along with it as well. And so he also speaks to food sovereignty and fasting as well as protective factors. And there's also scientific evidence that also looking into and studies around fasting and how fasting has positive effects on the body. And so our next testimony is from Ernie Albers Jr. And Ernie is Yurok, Hupa, and Karuk. He is a business owner. He's a wellness promotion specialist, a cultural bearer, and practitioner. He has knowledge of local ceremonies, village restoration, traditional stories, along with being a culinary chef and wellness and fitness coach. And so we'll take a moment to listen to the testimony of Ernie Albers and his perspective of protective factors from an Indigenous lens.
Neck now, Ernie Albers. Nepichawas, well, Walt Lara, SC, Nick Mercado, SC, Awak, Wilfred Albers. Nikuchawas, well, Cali Lara, SC, Awak, Dolores Mercado, SC, Awak, Mamie Markison. Serper, SC, Hupa, SC, T-Bar, Newimachuk. Hello, my name is Ernie Albers. I introduced some of who my grandparents are and some of the places that I come from, where my blood comes from. My first experience in ceremony was when I was 3 years old. I was battling asthma pretty bad, and I had to go to the hospital multiple times a week, and the doctors didn't really have much they could do for me. And my family decided that we needed to have a brush dance for me, a healing ceremony. And so when I was 3, we had a ceremony out at Sumeg village. Throughout my life, I think that ceremony has given me and guided me a lot of the things and priorities that I have. When we're coming into ceremony, I have some things written down. When we're going into ceremony, we're mindful, we're deliberate, we're intentional, we're patient, we're loving. We come from community. We're able to be vulnerable. We're connected to each other, to the land. And when I take these different points and put them into my life and how I live my life and approach my obstacles, then it helps me become very much a balanced person. Or I feel like it makes me very rich. With all this ceremony, I always feel like it's a deeper connection, right? It teaches us on how to put something bigger than ourselves in the priority. We all have to play our roles and to contribute to something that's bigger. So learning what your role is and how to play that role and not to worry about what other people's role is. I tell people that, when we're in high dance, there's a medicine woman and a medicine man, and neither one of them are in charge of each other. They just they know that the other one is doing their job, and they're not worried about what they're doing, what the other person's doing, because they're worried about their own job, their own role. And if you're worried about someone else's role, you're not giving your whole heart to your role. And the more that we can do something together, the more powerful our ceremonies are. Ceremony has definitely given me the principles on how to live my life. What we say in ceremony is that if you're not in the right mind, then you shouldn't come. So whenever we go, there's, they say, if your enemy sits down at the table, you got to feed him. You got to feed your enemy, and not necessarily there's enemies, but any beefs that we have are all dropped. We come all together to do something special. So the lessons that I've learned in ceremony and time spent with elders and out at ceremony, I directly relate them to my job. I'm a coach. I co-own Lifted Arcata in Arcata. It's a functional movement gym, and we specialize in human-specific training. So a lot of times when I relate, I like to relate everything to ceremony. So when I relate movement to ceremony, I always do take those same principles of being mindful, deliberate, intentional, and putting it into movement. And so when we are moving correctly and we're checking in with our body and we're working on dysfunctions and imbalances, you know, we're paying our body respect. And I feel like we're approaching it in a ceremonial way, the right way. And we don't have aesthetic or sports specific or competition in the priority. It's very healing. It's wellness. You know, we put wellness in the priority, and so that all comes from the priorities of ceremony. Of, you know, we all pitch in, we all do our part, and we're all focusing on what's at hand. And so as far as like going with my family and how it benefits my kids, I always tell people that we're in such a blessed time right now because we have so many ceremonies to go to. You know, my grandfather's generation did a lot of fighting for our rights to be able to do a lot of ceremonies, and my sons will always know a time that there's been opportunities for them to go and to be a part of ceremony, and super special. So such a wonderful opportunity for them to know community, to know love, to know where they belong, what they believe, that they have a responsibility, they have connection to places and people. You know, those things are priceless. I always say that when you have somewhere that you know you belong, that's the priceless thing. Going back to Lifted, I like to say that with that, I want to provide the opportunity for people to experience community and self-care. But I always like to say that's a sneaky way of saying have them experience culture and community and ceremony. And it's the same thing of needing one another and doing things that are strenuous and uncomfortable, taking yourself out of your uncomfort zone and being able to be vulnerable with each other. All those things are definitely aspects of ceremony when we're hiking, or when we're packing stuff up, or when we're staying up all night, or dancing. You know, all these things are very strenuous, physical strenuous things, but they're also very mentally strenuous when we're fasting and we're exhausted. And, you know, there's all kinds of physical and mental challenges that come with being a part of ceremony. And through all that sacrifice, you gain so much strength, so much knowledge and wisdom and love. And, you know, that's definitely set me on the course that I want to walk, that I want to be a good example of what wellness looks like, and what wellness and happiness looks like, I guess I would say, from a ceremonial aspect. Growing up Native, around a lot of non-Native people, there were definitely challenging times, and times that I didn't want to be different, or I didn't want to, you know, everybody wants to fit in with the in crowd and do what everybody else is doing. You know, for me, so it was challenging to have to go to ceremony a lot, to go and spend time away from my friends and away from this world, and go be with my grandpa and my grandma and my aunties, and go be a part of these ceremonies. And as a kid, I didn't necessarily appreciate them as much, but now looking back, how much it has shaped who I am, and how awesome of an opportunity I had to be a part of ceremony, and to have something that makes me feel good about being me, gives me purpose. And I always tell people with being living where you come from, you know, it's such an opportunity to live where your people have lived for thousands of years, and do the ceremonies that your people have been doing for thousands of years. And you know what you believe, you know why you're here, and like I said, you have responsibility. It's fulfilling. And, you know, as you become an adult, you realize how many people don't have that. And so growing up in it and having that, it was always there. It was always the backbone of who I am, and why I'm being healthy, and why I'm making the decisions that I make to keep myself in the right mindset and the right place to participate in ceremony and go to ceremony. Whenever I wasn't acting right, my mom would say, do I need to call your grandpa? And that was like the worst threat. I would straighten up real fast. Like, no, I don't want grandpa to know if I'm acting up. Other things that help me outside of ceremony is definitely culture related. I was involved in a lot of different youth opportunities, youth groups. I was a part of TAG, it's a teen advisory group, and I had some separate down for them through TAG. Different skills that we were able to learn. I learned was taking job interviews, doing budget planning, even just traveling, being able to have the opportunity to go into check into hotels, experience different cities outside of where I live, making money. There's different committees, planning events, writing newsletters, facilitating. All those skills directly involve what I do, especially the facilitating skills. What I do on the daily, I'm at my job as a coach, as a fitness trainer, as a presenter. All these things, public speaking, confidence building, and as also part of some groups called Power, peers offering wisdom, education, respect. The Yurok Tribe Youth Council. I've been to a lot of different UIHS summer camps, and all this exposure to culture, kids my own age, and opportunity to learn. It was all just things to do and fun as I was growing up. But as an adult, looking back, knowing that I was learning and really paving the way to what I'm supposed to be doing, what I want to do, and just building the confidence to do that really helped. I feel like all those different programs helped give me that confidence to know that I have a voice and that I can speak and that I can go places, and people will respect me, and I'm not, I don't need to be mean or be intimidating, to have respect. And as well as, I don't have to come from money, or I don't have to, do things the wrong way to be successful, through work and sweat and ceremony, culture, all those things. I feel like helped me be to where I am today. Business owner. I do presentations. Talk a little bit about movement and about ceremonial movement. And so I'm a functional movement system certified FMS. And so I do a lot of correctives and a lot of helping people get better from their injuries or injury prevention, start their fitness journey, have programs that are specified for them. And with ceremony, I've always said that ceremony and traditional living made us fit by byproduct of our way of life. I'm teaching people these foundational developmental postures and movements, and they're all things that we do in ceremony. We're always relate on half kneeling and deep squats and rotational split stances, crawling, lunging, all these things that we do in ceremony and in traditional life. They're things that I teach people how to do at the gym on the daily. And it's to have that connection of our people knowing how to be fit and how to be healthy, it's a key. You know what I mean? That the more that we almost de-evolve to who we were before this society, is the key for me. I feel like a wonderful woman named Carrie, and I have two beautiful sons named Caleb Nickwich and Elijah Churi. One's 7 and one's 1, and couldn't do an interview or tell you about who I am without introducing my family as well, because they're definitely my why. And like I said, having my sons be able to have opportunity to be in ceremony, around ceremony, that's very, very special to me and them. And the more you understand them, then you're able to help them in a better way and come from a different place of respect and love, and place of ceremony.
Okay, so that's Ernie Albers Jr. And so we'll do the share screen again so you can all see the PowerPoint. And so Ernie describes how ceremony has guided his life and given him purpose. And so he identifies the brush dance and the healing ceremony. He shared that when he was 3 years old that he had asthma. And so he had a healing ceremony at that age. That he talks about ceremony as being mindful, deliberate, intentional, and loving. These are all things that he identifies as protective factors. And remember, protective factors are tools that interrupt toxic stress. And so despite high ACE scores or despite intergenerational trauma or intergenerational transmission of adversity, that these are tools that interrupt toxic stress. And so, and kind of prevent the types of health disparities that could potentially develop. He also describes time with elders, with his grandparents. He talked about paying the body respect, and this is in relation to self-care. And we learn these things through culture and through ceremony, is how to take care of ourselves. He also talked about belonging to place and having this connection to homeland, which we've spoken about in previous modules, but knowing the place that your people have always been. He talks about hiking and ceremony and about how ceremony can be work, but when you work together as a community, that it can be so rewarding and it helps to establish such strength and such growth. He talked about body movement, the movements of dancing and ceremony. And there's also studies about the movement and how it affects the brain and how it affects development that really validates dancing and movement in ceremony. He also talked about fasting, that although fasting can be something that's very challenging, it also can be the best times of a person's life. And then the youth support groups that he was a part of, that he felt were protective factors, the different programs that taught him skills, that helped him to identify himself as a young man in the community. And so we see this diagram again, which we talked about earlier in this module, and then also in modules previously, is looking at these types of resilience tools. And so when we talk about interrupting toxic stress and we look at protective factors from an Indigenous perspective, that these are some of the protective factors, which ironically in this study were also things that when parents were asked, what are the 5 most important things to teach to your children? These are the things that Lara-Cooper Karuk parents identified as being important. Well, these can also be resilience tools, protective factors, things like participating in ceremony, singing, fasting, dancing, hiking on ceremonial trails, gathering, fishing, relationships with the natural environment, connections to teachers and elders, basket making, running. These are things that can all interrupt toxic stress from an Indigenous perspective. And likewise, Yellowbird, Michael Yellowbird has done research on neurodecolonization, and his research suggests that these activities can heal the body from the effects of intergenerational trauma and ongoing oppression. And another study on Indigenous youth found that cultural affinity promotes self-esteem, and that cultural identity combined with high self-esteem is a protective factor against alcohol and substance abuse. And so just looking at that again and kind of processing that information again, is that this cultural affinity promotes self-esteem and cultural identity, and combined with high self-esteem is a protective factor against alcohol and substance abuse. And so these pieces that have been a part of Indigenous knowledge and have been a part of ChemTem, the treasures of the people, are also tools from an Indigenous perspective that can interrupt toxic stress. And so when a child experiences trauma, the architecture of the developing brain can be impacted in multiple ways. And so as a result, a person's emotional regulation, their attention span, their memory can be affected by these traumatic events. And so the brain, however, is malleable. And that means that the brain can heal, and that healing occurs when the brain is stimulated. And according to Yellowbird, stimulation transpires when an Indigenous person is engaged in regalia making, basket making, singing, or in ceremony. And so at this moment, a person has a sense of well-being when they're working on baskets or when they're singing in ceremony, that the temporal parietal junction of the brain becomes activated and the individual transcends to a level of happiness, joy, and optimism. In other words, the act of participating in cultural activities stimulates the brain and releases feelings of positivity, which can lead to healing. And so it's important to follow up with this type of research. Michael Yellowbird, his book, Decolonizing the Mind, Healing Through Neurodecolonization and Mindfulness. Also, Bruce Perry, a senior fellow of the Trauma Academy and a leading practitioner of children's mental health, he states that key aspects of healthy child development already exist in healthy Indigenous cultures. And so he says they already exist in Indigenous healthy cultures. So for example, Indigenous cultures are wealthy in relationships with grandparents, extended family, and community. And these communal interactions with children help to nurture physical, social, and emotional health. And so for Indigenous families that are out of balance due to trauma, oppression, colonialism, it's important, in his words, Dr. Bruce Perry's words, to reweave the social fabric and recapture the old ways. And in recentering and reclaiming Indigenous knowledge, children build an anchor in their own home culture that gives them the strength to cope with marginalization by mainstream society. And so the testimonials that are shared in this module highlight perspectives of protective factors that mitigate stress. And so this diagram here, once again, highlights some of these things that are mentioned, and resilience tools or protective factors from an Indigenous perspective are identified. And once again, all of these pieces, the relationships with the human, natural, spiritual realms, the cultural values, the cultural skills and values, they're all connected through this common thread, which is language. In looking at strategies for regulating the toxic stress response. So as Peter Gensaw stated in his testimony, he said that brain science is just now catching up with the teachings that come from our people. And many of these evidence-based strategies to mitigate the toxic stress response mirror many Indigenous teachings around family, relationships, and connections to the natural environment. And so when we're screening for ACEs, ACE-associated health conditions and protective factors, that we have to really think about what is it that we want to know and what do we need to know to heal, or in other words, to treat toxic stress. And so these 7 areas, when we look at quality sleep, balanced nutrition, physical activity, mindfulness practices, experiencing nature, mental health care, supportive relationships. And so one thing, and if you see one thing from this slide, that toxic stress is treatable. And we have tools and strategies to help people heal their physiology. And so now that we've heard the testimonials from members of the Indigenous community, how has your view of trauma-informed care evolved? What are some important factors to consider to establish trust, safety, and collaborative decision-making? And we've kind of been talking about this throughout the entire presentation, but what are some of the ways that we can support a trusting relationships, a safe environment? And how does the content of the module impact screening for ACEs and treatment of toxic stress? So these are things to kind of think about as we have these discussions here.